Hello there, and welcome to Planet in Question, the little corner where curiosity drifts slowly, where science and imagination meet without hurry, and where the questions we whisper into the dark can unfold gently across the quiet of the night. Tonight, I'd like to invite you into a thought that has lingered in human storytelling for centuries, perhaps even millennia. The idea that the Ice Age may have hidden a civilization older than any we know. It is a thought that arrives not with loud certainty but with soft wonder, the kind of idea you turn over in your mind while listening to rain or staring at the horizon, not to solve but simply to explore. Before we begin, I'd like to ask something simple, something grounding. Where are you listening from right now? Perhaps you are tucked into bed, the lights low, seeking rest as your day winds down. Perhaps you are listening in the soft hours of the morning, when the world outside hasn't yet stirred, and the sky still carries a faint blue. Or maybe you found this in the middle of a busy day, searching for a moment of calm in the flow of everything else. However you've arrived here, this is a space to let your mind wander slowly, to imagine what the Earth might have kept hidden beneath its shifting waters and melting ice. The last ice age was not so long ago in the grand scale of Earth's history. Just a geological heartbeat, really. It ended around 12,000 years ago, when vast ice sheets that had stretched across continents began to retreat. Those glaciers were immense, miles thick in places, covering much of North America, Europe, and Asia. They pressed down on the land itself, carving valleys, shaping mountains, redirecting rivers. Beneath them, the world we know today was waiting, but in a very different form. Seas were lower by over 100 meters. Entire landscapes now drowned by the ocean were once exposed broad plains, where humans and animals may have walked side by side. Imagine standing on ground that now lies far beneath the waves, the air cold, the horizon stretching far. That was Earth during the Ice Age, both harsh and full of hidden opportunity. The people who lived in that time were not blank slates, not simple shadows of what would one day be called civilization. They were artists, leaving behind cave paintings that still shimmer faintly with the marks of their hands. They were tool makers, shaping stone into blades and points. They were travelers, spreading across continents, adapting to forests, plains, deserts, and tundra. But the question that lingers is whether they, or perhaps others alongside them, were more than we imagine. Could there have been a civilization, organized, knowledgeable, perhaps even technologically advanced in ways that we do not easily recognize, that rose and then fell before the ice melted, leaving little more than faint echoes? The problem is not imagination, but evidence. Our oldest known cities, places like Jericho or Çatalhöyük, appear only around 10,000 years ago, after the Ice Age ended. Conventional history says that agriculture, permanent settlements, and monumental architecture followed the retreat of the glaciers, when stable climates allowed humans to settle and experiment with farming. Yet scattered across the world are traces that do not fit neatly into that timeline. Stone sites that seem older than they should be, myths of sunken lands passed down through generations, and vast stretches of the ocean floor where no archaeologist has yet set foot. It is tempting to think of lost civilizations in terms of great stone temples or towering pyramids, things we could easily recognize. But what if their remains do not look like what we expect? What if they were built along coastlines that no longer exist, swept away when the seas rose? What if their tools were made of wood or other materials that vanished long ago? Even in our own world today, if everything we built were left to crumble, how much would survive 10 or 20,000 years? Steel would rust, concrete would break apart, satellites would fall from the sky, perhaps only scattered traces in geology would remain. If such a thing is true for us, how much more so for a people who might have lived long before us with a different way of shaping their world? The Ice Age feels like a curtain across time. Behind it lies a world we can picture only dimly, a world colder but not empty, a world where humans survived by their wits, where animals we no longer know roamed in great numbers, and where entire coastlines now hidden beneath the sea might once have carried villages, cities, perhaps even civilizations. To imagine that possibility is not to say we have found proof, but to allow our minds to wander gently across the landscapes of what might have been. As we move together into this journey, keep in mind that history is rarely complete. It is not a neat story written from beginning to end. It is a puzzle missing countless pieces, with entire chapters perhaps lost to water and ice. We walk across a planet that has forgotten far more than it remembers, and every so often we stumble across a stone, a carving, or a myth that hints at deeper layers. Maybe those layers belong only to imagination, or maybe they belong to something real, something older, waiting in silence beneath the ocean's weight. So, tonight, let us slow down and walk through that thought. Let us picture the Earth during its long winter of ice, and wonder together whether a civilization once thrived there, only to vanish beneath the floodwaters of a changing world. There is no rush to find an answer. The value lies in the wondering, in the soft pause it gives us as we look at the history we think we know, and admit that much of it remains a mystery. And if you find this kind of quiet exploration comforting, if it helps you drift toward rest or simply eases the day, I'd be grateful if you pressed like, or subscribed, or shared this small space of calm with someone else who might need it. For now, let's begin our slow journey into the Ice Age, and the possibility of a civilization that time itself has chosen to hide. 1. The silent weight of ice. Picture, if you will, a world quieter than our own. A world where the wind carried differently, where the seas were lower, and where the horizon was often rimmed not by forest or mountain but by walls of ice. During the height of the last ice age, vast glaciers stretched across continents. They were immense, unimaginably so, miles thick in some regions, pressing down with such weight that the land itself bent beneath them. What we think of as familiar landscapes, New York's skyline, the fields of northern Europe, the Canadian plains, were then buried beneath silent, glittering sheets of ice. The world had not been abandoned, it was simply reshaped into something alien to us. And within that frozen silence, life still carried on. The ice was not uniform. It carved valleys as it moved, leaving behind gouges that would later become lakes. It pressed stone to dust, dragged boulders across entire landscapes, and shifted rivers from one course to another. Where the glaciers ended, meltwater spilled outward, feeding plains and carving deep canyons. This was Earth sculpting itself with a slow but relentless hand. And above all, there was the sound of silence, the quiet weight of frozen time pressing down on the land. For the people of that age, if indeed people were there in numbers larger than we now imagine, the ice must have seemed eternal. To us, glaciers are rare, found only in remote mountain ranges or at the edges of polar regions. But to them, it was the backdrop of existence. Imagine looking north and seeing a white wall stretching as far as the eye could reach. Imagine entire generations being born, living, and passing away without ever knowing a landscape free of ice. That silence was not empty. It carried the echoes of life, of mammoths trudging across the plains, of reindeer herds following ancient paths, of humans huddled in shelters of bone and hide, building fires that glowed like fragile stars against the frozen night. The world was colder then, but also richer in ways we forget. Lower sea levels exposed entire tracts of land that are now gone. Broad coastal plains extended for miles where water now lies. You could have walked from what is now France to Britain without needing a boat, crossing an expanse of grasslands known as Doggerland. You could have wandered across the Bering Land Bridge, where Asia touched North America. These were not small strips of earth. They were vast and fertile, supporting animals, plants, and perhaps even people. Yet today they are silent seafloors, hidden beneath waves that carry no trace of what once stood there. The glaciers themselves carried mysteries. Beneath them, rivers flowed under pressure, hidden from the sky. Caverns carved by water, ice caves glittering with blue light, landscapes concealed in darkness. It is not difficult to imagine that anything small settlements, sacred spaces, or even entire ways of life could have existed near those edges, only to be erased as the ice withdrew. Our imagination, once given room, begins to wander. What if the silent weight of ice concealed more than stone? What if it buried memories of people who had learned how to thrive in that strange world? Scientists study these frozen epochs through cores drilled deep into the ice, through sediments laid down in ancient seas, through the marks left behind by glaciers that are long gone. And yet, evidence grows faint with time. Ice melts, stone erodes, water floods in, the earth erases much of its own story. That erasure is what makes the possibility of a hidden civilization both haunting and strangely plausible. If something had risen in those ages, something fragile, something fleeting, it might have been smoothed away by the weight of time. Consider how different silence would have sounded then. We live in a world filled with noise, engines, voices, machines humming at all hours. But during the Ice Age, the loudest sounds were often natural ones. The crack of ice breaking, the low thunder of glaciers moving, the rush of meltwater carving new paths. And against this background, perhaps the faint murmur of human life, so small compared to the forces around them. It makes one wonder, how would a civilization grow in such a place? Slowly, cautiously, perhaps with traditions built around the cycles of freeze and thaw, around the steady presence of ice that seemed immovable, eternal. And yet, the ice was not forever. Slowly, subtly, it began to retreat. Warmer days lengthened, seas rose. The silence shifted, broken by rivers swelling, coastlines reshaping, animals migrating into newly thawed lands. To those living then, it must have felt like the world itself was stirring awake. But what did that awakening sweep away? What might have been built in the shadow of ice, only to be swallowed by water, forgotten by stone, erased from memory? The silent weight of ice is both literal and symbolic. It speaks not only of the glaciers themselves, but of the way history presses down, concealing layers beneath it. We walk on a world where much has been hidden, where time itself has smoothed away the marks of what once was. In this silence, questions arise like faint echoes. Could the Ice Age have been home to more than survival? Could it have nurtured a civilization that whispered its stories into the cold air, stories we no longer hear? As we drift through this thought, there is no need for conclusion. We are not racing to find proof. We are simply standing still in that ancient silence, listening, imagining the weight of ice pressing down on land, on memory, on possibility. For now, it is enough to wonder whether the world of glaciers and low seas carried more than we remember, whether beneath that white shroud there was not only stone and snow, but the faint traces of human hands shaping lives that the earth has since chosen to hide. 2. Forgotten coastlines. When we think of the earth today, the outlines of the continents feel fixed, as though they have always been the same. Maps in classrooms and globes on desks tell us that the boundaries of land and sea are permanent, something we can trust. But that picture is only a snapshot, a still frame in a film that has been running for millions of years. During the last ice age, the edges of the continents were drawn very differently. Because so much of the planet's water was locked away in ice sheets, the sea levels were far lower, more than 100 meters below where they are today. What this meant was that whole landscapes now hidden beneath the ocean were once dry ground. Forgotten coastlines stretched outward into plains, valleys, and riverbeds that no one alive today has ever walked. These places may have been home to animals, plants, and even people, their traces now lost under the waves. If you close your eyes, you might try to imagine such a world. Standing on the cliffs of present-day Britain, instead of seeing only the North Sea, you would see grasslands stretching far across the horizon, eventually meeting the forests of Europe. That land, known now as Doggerland, was once a thriving environment where mammoths grazed and early humans roamed. In the north, where Alaska and Siberia now face each other across the Bering Strait, a vast bridge of land once connected them. Herds of animals crossed it, followed by humans who carried their lives into a new continent. In places like Southeast Asia, coastlines extended much farther, turning scattered islands into broad, connected territories. The world was not only colder then, it was wider, more spacious, offering land where now there is only sea. The thought that these forgotten coastlines are now hidden beneath the ocean adds a layer of mystery, for when the ice melted and the waters rose, they did not rise gently everywhere. Some floods were sudden, swallowing valleys and plains in decades, even years. For the people who may have lived there, the ocean was not the calm blue horizon we know, but a force advancing steadily, swallowing fields, forests, and homes. Imagine the fear of watching waters claim the land where your ancestors had always lived. Imagine the urgency to move, to abandon what could not be saved. It is no wonder that so many cultures around the world carry stories of floods, of lands drowned, of civilizations swept away. They may not be literal memories, but they carry echoes of the great changes that the end of the Ice Age brought. The coastlines of the past invite us to ask gentle questions. If people lived along them, as they surely must have, what traces did they leave? Did they build shelters of wood and stone which are now scattered and buried beneath silt? Did they carve symbols, plant fields, tell stories that were passed down only until the waves claimed their homes? Today, archaeologists are just beginning to explore these submerged landscapes with sonar, submersibles, and divers, and every so often they find hints, traces of tools, patterns in stone that look like walls, fossils of animals that lived alongside humans. Each discovery feels like a whisper from the forgotten world beneath the waves. But there is something humbling here as well. Our modern cities are mostly coastal. If the seas were to rise again by 100 meters, many of them would vanish, just as Doggerland did, just as Beringia did. In a future world, if someone looked back, would they know we had been here? Or would our coastlines too be reduced to nothing but sediment and silence? It reminds us that the forgotten coastlines of the Ice Age are not unique. They are part of a cycle, a rhythm of the earth where land appears, thrives, and then disappears beneath the sea. We happen to live in a calm moment, one where the boundaries of ocean and land feel steady. But they are not steady at all, they are only paused. In those forgotten coastlines lies another possibility, that much of what we think of as the beginning of civilization may not have been a beginning at all, but a continuation. We often say that farming began about 10,000 years ago, that the first cities rose soon after. But what if those were not the first, only the survivors? What if the true first attempts at villages, at organized life, at monuments and art, were drowned by the sea? What if our history begins not with the first spark of civilization, but with the survivors of a flood carrying fragments of knowledge inland, planting them again in safer ground? To walk along those ancient coastlines in your mind is to feel a sense of loss, but also of wonder. Imagine standing on a plain where today fish swim, hearing the wind across tall grass, seeing herds moving in the distance. Imagine rivers that now flow unseen beneath the waves, carving paths through valleys that were once alive with sound. Imagine fires burning on shores where no shore exists anymore, communities gathering, sharing food, telling stories as the stars wheeled above them. These things are gone, erased not by time alone but by water, the most patient of erasers. And yet, the possibility remains that somewhere under the waves, fragments still exist, waiting quietly to be found. We call them forgotten coastlines, but perhaps they are not entirely forgotten. They live on in the myths of flood and loss, in the memories carried through generations, in the faint marks left on stone beneath the sea. And they live on in us, in our curiosity, in the questions we ask late at night when we let ourselves wonder, what if something important lies beneath the waves? What if the first chapter of our story is not written on dry land, but in the drowned world just beyond the horizon? The forgotten coastlines are not gone forever. They are there, beneath the ocean, silent but real. And as we imagine them, as we trace their outlines in our minds, we find ourselves not only looking backward into the Ice Age, but forward as well into the possibility that our own coastlines too may one day join them, becoming another layer in the shifting story of Earth. And perhaps, thousands of years from now, others will ask the same gentle questions about us, about what we built and about what we left behind, just as we now wonder about the civilizations that may have lived on the shores of the forgotten Ice Age seas. 3. Myths of sunken worlds. For as long as people have gathered around fires to tell stories, there have been tales of lands swallowed by the sea. They are stories that ripple through cultures across the globe, from the warm islands of the Pacific to the mountains of Greece, from the river valleys of India to the coasts of the Americas. At first glance, they seem like myths, pure imagination woven into legend. But when the same kind of story appears in so many different places, it begins to take on another shape. Perhaps these tales are not only fiction, but faint memories of something real, echoes of coastlines drowned at the end of the Ice Age, whispered through generations until they became myth. Atlantis is the name that most often comes to mind. The philosopher Plato described it more than 2,000 years ago, speaking of a mighty island nation that vanished beneath the waves in a single day and night of catastrophe. For centuries, people have searched for it in the Atlantic, in the Mediterranean, even in the Caribbean. The details vary, but the image remains the same, a place of knowledge, wealth, or greatness, swallowed by the ocean without a trace. Whether Atlantis was invention, allegory, or distorted memory, the idea that such a place could exist and then vanish has never left us. But Atlantis is not alone. In India, There are ancient tales of Kumari Kandam, a great land south of the continent that once stretched across what is now the Indian Ocean. In some traditions, it was said to have been home to vast cities and learned people before it sank into the sea. Across the Pacific, many island cultures carry stories of lands that once stood above water but were taken by rising seas. In the Philippines, in Polynesia, and in Micronesia, elders spoke of ancestral homes now lost beneath the waves, their tops sometimes visible on clear days. In the Americas, indigenous peoples told of floods that swept across plains and mountains, forcing survivors to seek higher ground. These are not isolated stories, they are a chorus, each culture singing its own version of a memory that feels strangely universal. What makes these myths compelling is not only their similarity but their persistence. Thousands of years have passed since the seas rose to their modern levels, yet the stories remain. They are like fossils of memory, carried in words rather than stone. And just as fossils tell us about creatures long gone, these stories may tell us about lands long drowned. Perhaps they were not entire continents, but coastlines, valleys, or islands where people once lived. When the waters rose, their homes vanished, and the only way to preserve them was through story. Over time, stories became myths, myths became legends, and legends became dismissed as fantasy. But what if, beneath that fantasy, there is truth? When we think of myth, we often separate it from history. We imagine history as the record of what truly happened, and myth as the realm of imagination. Yet, in many cultures, myth is memory. It is how people recorded what they experienced when they had no paper, no ink, no stone inscriptions. A flood myth may not describe an event exactly as it occurred, but it may preserve the memory of water rising, of homes being lost, of people forced to move. And if we listen closely, we may hear in these myths the story of the end of the Ice Age, when glaciers melted and seas rose, swallowing the forgotten coastlines we now know must have existed. Imagine being part of a community living near the shore at that time. For generations, the land is stable. Families farm or hunt or gather near rivers and bays, trusting that the sea will remain where it has always been. Then, slowly at first, but then more quickly, the water begins to rise. Hills become islands. Valleys flood. Rivers change their courses. The land where your grandparents lived is gone. To you, it feels like the sea is alive, like it is taking the world you know. You tell your children, and they tell theirs, and the story carries forward. The sea rose, and the land was lost. In time, that story becomes myth. And in the way of myths, it becomes richer, stranger, more symbolic. Gods or spirits are blamed. Morality is attached. The flood is punishment, or destiny, or cleansing. But at its core, it is memory, the memory of a world reshaped. We cannot say for certain that any myth refers to a real lost civilization, but we also cannot dismiss them so easily. Archaeologists have found submerged ruins near the coasts of India, where sonar revealed patterns of stone that resemble walls and streets. Off the coast of Japan, the Yonaguni Monument lies beneath the waves, a massive stepped formation that some believe is natural, and others insist was shaped by human hands long ago. In the Mediterranean, remnants of drowned towns are found here and there, reminders that the sea has always advanced and retreated. These discoveries do not prove the myths true, but they suggest that human memory of lost lands may indeed stretch farther back than we once believed. And so, myths of sunken worlds are not only entertainment or allegory, they are invitations. They invite us to imagine the world as it was, to consider that what we think of as the whole of history may only be a fragment. They remind us that our ancestors lived through immense changes so vast they could only be understood through story. And they whisper to us that perhaps, just perhaps, we are not the first to build, to organize, to dream of permanence. Perhaps others tried before us, and the sea erased their traces, leaving only the myths behind. There is something profoundly human in this. We know that our own cities, if abandoned, would not last forever. Skyscrapers would fall, concrete would crack, and within a few thousand years, most of what we have built would be gone. If myths were all that survived of us, what would they say? Would they tell of towers touching the sky, of lights that burned brighter than stars, of machines that flew across oceans? Would those myths sound impossible to future generations, dismissed as fantasy when in fact they were memory? In this way, the myths of sunken worlds remind us that history is fragile, that memory can last longer than stone, and that the line between legend and truth is thinner than we often admit. So when you hear of Atlantis or Kumari Kandam, or of flood stories told across cultures, imagine not only the myth but the possibility that it carries. Imagine that beneath the waves lie valleys where people once walked, where children once played, where fires once burned against the cold. Imagine that the ocean itself is the keeper of their stories, silent but vast, holding secrets we have only begun to seek. And then imagine the patience of myth, how it carried those memories across centuries until they reached us, disguised as legend but perhaps rooted in truth. To dwell on these myths is not to solve them, but to listen to them, to let them remind us that we live on a planet that is always changing, always erasing and rewriting its own story. The sunken worlds may never rise again, but their echoes linger, calling us to remember that we too are temporary, that we too may one day leave behind only whispers in story and stone. And perhaps that is enough, not proof, not certainty, but wonder. 4. The archaeologist's puzzle. When we picture archaeology, many of us imagine someone dusting a golden statue, uncovering a buried temple, or piecing together a broken pot that has been hidden for centuries. These are the treasures of human history, tangible and immediate. But when we look farther back, into the deep shadows of time, before cities, before written language, before the end of the Ice Age, the work becomes less like uncovering and more like guessing. The Earth itself is not a careful archivist. It erases, it buries, it grinds away. What remains of the distant past is not a tidy record, but a puzzle with most of the pieces missing, and sometimes even the edges smoothed away so we can't quite tell what we are holding. This is the challenge faced when we ask whether a lost civilization might have existed during the Ice Age. On the surface, the answer seems straightforward. We have no clear ruins, no preserved cities, no writing from that time, and yet, absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence. To understand why, we must think about how fragile evidence truly is. Imagine a wooden house built 12,000 years ago on a coastline that is now underwater. How long would that wood last? Exposed to water, it would rot within decades. Buried beneath sediment, it might survive as fragments, but only under the most careful of conditions. Imagine the tools they might have used: stone, yes, which can survive for millennia, but what of leather, rope, or bone? These things vanish quickly, dissolving into soil or sea. In just a few centuries, even strong materials begin to fade. In a few thousand, almost everything is gone. The puzzle grows harder when we realize how little of the Earth's surface has been studied with this question in mind. Archaeology is biased toward what is easiest to reach: dry land, shallow soil, places where stone and pottery remain. But during the Ice Age, much of the land where people might have lived is now underwater, swallowed by rising seas. The coastlines of the past, likely the most fertile and populated areas, are now the seafloors we rarely explore. Only a fraction of those drowned landscapes have been surveyed, and even fewer excavated. What lies hidden beneath layers of sand and silt may be more than we dare guess. And yet, every so often, a piece of the puzzle emerges. Off the coast of India, sonar scans revealed what looked like the outlines of ancient walls and streets, drowned beneath the waters of the Gulf of Combat. In Japan, the Yonaguni Monument, massive stone steps and terraces beneath the sea, has stirred debate for decades. Are they natural formations, or the remnants of something built long ago? In the Mediterranean, divers have found traces of drowned towns, streets that once echoed with footsteps now home to fish. None of these prove the existence of a great Ice Age civilization, but they remind us of how much the ocean has hidden, and how difficult it is to say with certainty what is not there. The Earth complicates the puzzle even further by recycling itself. Rocks are pushed back into the planet's interior, melted and remade. Mountains rise and crumble. Rivers carve valleys, then shift their courses, erasing the traces of what once lay there. In this endless cycle, evidence is fragile. A city abandoned today would leave only ruins after a few hundred years. In a few thousand, most of it would be gone. After 10,000, what would remain? Perhaps a scatter of unusual minerals, a faint pattern in stone, something so subtle that future eyes might not even recognize it as human. Now, imagine tens of thousands of years, how much harder it would be to notice. This is why some scientists speak of what they call the Silurian hypothesis, The idea that if a technological civilization had existed millions of years ago, we might not find direct artifacts, but only subtle chemical signatures, odd layers of metals, unusual isotopes, signs of activity in the rocks. In other words, the puzzle pieces we expect, like walls or tools, may be gone, while the puzzle itself is still there, waiting to be assembled from the faintest of clues. The Ice Age is not millions of years behind us, but even so, the same challenge applies. What remains may not look like evidence unless we know how to see it. The archaeologist's puzzle, then, is not only about finding pieces, but about recognizing them when they appear. A shard of stone might be dismissed as natural unless someone looks closely. A line of rocks might seem like chance unless seen in a broader pattern. Even myths, stories carried across generations, may be puzzle pieces less precise than pottery or stone, but still part of the picture. Each fragment adds to the whole, but the whole will never be complete. The Earth will not allow it. What we are left with are glimpses, suggestions, the possibility that something larger once existed but is now mostly gone. This uncertainty can feel frustrating if we crave clear answers, but there is also a quiet beauty in it. To know that the world has erased so much is to know that it still holds secrets, that there are questions we may never finish answering. The puzzle is not something to be solved once and for all, but something to be lived with, something that humbles us. It reminds us that our place in history is small, that the record we see is only the top layer of a much deeper story. It teaches us patience and curiosity, and the willingness to accept mystery as part of knowledge. So when we think about the possibility of a lost civilization during the Ice Age, we must hold both ideas at once. On one hand, the evidence is scarce, faint, sometimes absent. On the other, the conditions for erasure are strong, perhaps strong enough that even a thriving people could vanish without a trace. Between those two truths lies the puzzle, waiting quietly for us to piece together what we can. And maybe the act of wondering itself is part of the answer, not to prove or disprove, but to recognize that Earth's story is deeper and more fragile than we once thought. The archaeologist's puzzle is not one of certainty. It is one of fragments, whispers, and the patience to listen. And as we listen, we begin to see the Ice Age not only as a time of cold and survival, but as a canvas that may have carried more than we know, its traces hidden beneath ice, water, and time. 5. Survivors on the shore. When we imagine the Ice Age, we often think of endless glaciers and bitter cold, but this was not the whole story. Along the edges of the ice sheets, in valleys, forests, and coasts, life carried on in ways we can still glimpse through the remains left behind. People survived their small groups, families, tribes hunting, gathering, carving tools, and leaving their faint but lasting marks on stone and bone. They were survivors on the shore, not only of seas but of history itself, standing between the world that was vanishing and the one that was about to begin. It is through them that we catch our clearest glimpse of what life might have looked like at the margins of a forgotten age. We know some of these survivors through their art. Deep inside caves in France and Spain, paintings still glow faintly in torchlight after tens of thousands of years. Mammoths, bison, horses, and mysterious symbols cover the walls, painted with ochre and charcoal. These were not idle sketches. They carried meaning, memory, perhaps ritual. They remind us that the people of that time were not shadows of humanity, but fully alive, creative, and thoughtful. They were looking at the world around them with wonder and trying to fix it in place, to preserve it. Their paintings were not only for beauty but for survival, a way of remembering the animals they hunted, the landscapes they walked, the spirits they sensed in the world. They also left behind tools, flint blades chipped to perfection, bone needles, ornaments carved from ivory. These artifacts speak of a people who understood their environment, who adapted to the challenges of cold and scarcity. They lived in shelters of hide and bone, or in caves carved into stone. They lit fires that burned through long nights, fed by wood gathered carefully, guarded like treasure. They followed the herds across plains, moved with the seasons, carried their children on journeys that stretched across continents. They were not static, but travelers, always adjusting to the changing world around them. But here is where the wondering begins. We know these survivors, these artists and hunters, because they left evidence on land. What of those who may have lived along the coasts that are now gone? If humans gathered near rivers and oceans, as they so often do, then many of their lives unfolded on shores now drowned. For every cave painting preserved inland, how many wooden shelters were swallowed by rising seas? For every flint blade left behind on dry ground, how many tools were lost to the tides? The survivors on the shore may have been more numerous than those we remember, their stories washed away as the waters rose. It is possible, then, that our picture of the past is incomplete, drawn only from the fragments that survived by chance. The survivors we know about lived inland, in caves and valleys that protected their art and tools. But the survivors we do not know, the ones who may have lived in villages along rivers now buried beneath oceans, are lost to us. Their lives might have been richer than we imagine, their knowledge deeper. They might have begun the first steps toward organized life, steps erased before they could leave a trace. And yet, something of them may linger. When the Ice Age ended and the seas rose, people were forced inland. They carried memories with them, skills, and perhaps fragments of knowledge. The sudden leap in human culture after the Ice Age, the rise of agriculture, the building of monumental sites like Göbekli Tepe may not have been a leap from nothing, but the survival of ideas carried by those who fled the drowning shores. The survivors on the shore may have been the bridge between a lost world and the one we now call history. Think of Göbekli Tepe itself. Massive carved stones arranged in circles, built over 11,000 years ago, at a time when most humans were still living in small groups. It appears too advanced for its age, as though it sprang from nowhere. But what if it did not? What if the people who built it carried with them knowledge preserved from an earlier time, passed down from communities that had lived in places now lost? In that sense, the survivors on the shore were not only individuals, they were vessels carrying fragments of memory into the future. This possibility casts the survivors in a different light. They were not only hunters and gatherers struggling to endure, they may also have been the last heirs of a deeper story, one erased by water and ice. They may have known more than we assume, remembered more than we can prove. And when they carved their art or raised their stones, they may have been preserving not only their own lives, but the memory of lives that had already been taken by the sea. It is easy to underestimate them, because we look at the past through the lens of progress, as though life only grew more complex over time. But history is not a straight line. It rises and falls, advances and retreats. Civilizations flourish, then vanish, leaving behind only fragments. The survivors on the shore remind us that endurance is not always about building cities or writing books. Sometimes it is about carrying memory through silence, preserving it just long enough to plant it again in new soil. Their legacy, then, may be with us still. The sudden flowering of human culture after the Ice Age may be the echo of something older, whispered into the ears of those who lived through the flood. The survivors were not just witnesses to change, they were its messengers, carrying the past into the future. They remind us that even in the face of erasure, something endures. Not everything is lost to the sea. Some things are carried forward in memory, in myth, in the resilience of people who refuse to let go. And so, when we think of the survivors on the shore, we should not see them only as scattered tribes living at the edge of glaciers. We should see them as bridges, as keepers of stories, as the thread connecting a world erased to the world we now inhabit. Their fires may have burned low, their tools may have been simple, but their role was profound. They carried history across a chasm of forgetting, and in their hands may have been the faint traces of a civilization we can no longer see. They are gone now, as all things must go. But their legacy lives not only in the art they painted, or the tools they carved. It lives in us, in the curiosity that drives us to wonder, to imagine, to search for what has been hidden. We, too, are survivors on the shore, standing at the edge of what we know, gazing into the ocean of time and wondering what lies beneath. 6. The problem of time. Time is one of those things we move through without noticing, like air or water, always present but rarely questioned. Yet when we pause and try to hold it still in our minds, it slips away, impossible to grasp. For archaeologists, historians, and anyone curious about the past, time is both a guide and a barrier. It gives us a framework to understand what came first and what followed, but it also hides more than it reveals. The problem of time is not only that so much has been lost, but that the vastness of it dwarfs our ability to comprehend. And when we wonder whether a civilization might have existed during the Ice Age, the problem of time looms large, making it difficult to know what is truly possible and what is only dream. Think of it this way. Human civilization, as we usually define it, began around 10,000 years ago. Cities like Jericho and Çatalhöyük appeared after the Ice Age ended, when climates stabilized and agriculture began. Writing came later, around 5,000 years ago. The pyramids of Egypt are only about 4,500 years old, while the great stone temples of the Maya rose less than 2,000 years ago. To us, these seem unimaginably old. Yet in the span of Earth's history, they are barely a moment, the last flicker before midnight on the great clock of geological time. Now compare that to the Ice Age itself. The most recent glacial period began about 115,000 years ago and lasted until about 12,000 years ago. Within that stretch of over 100,000 years, entire generations lived and died, entire cultures rose and fell, and landscapes transformed again and again. Imagine trying to picture all of human history, every city, every empire, every story fit inside only the last 10% of that vast age of ice. The problem of time is that we measure by what we know, and what we know is such a small slice that it tempts us to think it is the whole. There is also the matter of perspective. 1,000 years seems enormous to us, the span of entire civilizations, yet to the Earth, 1,000 years is nothing. A glacier can advance or retreat in that span without leaving behind much more than a trace of sand and stone. A coastline can shift. A valley can flood. If people lived there, their traces could be erased in less time than it takes us to pass from the Roman Empire to the modern day. The problem of time is not only its length but its power to erode. We measure our lives in decades. The planet measures in millennia. This is why the possibility of an Ice Age civilization cannot be dismissed out of hand. If people had begun to gather in organized ways, to build villages or even cities along the forgotten coastlines, those places may have been lost before history ever had a chance to notice them. 12,000 years is more than enough for stone to crumble, wood to vanish, and seas to bury everything beneath layers of sediment. What we see as the beginning of civilization after the Ice Age may simply be the beginning of what survived. The problem of time also appears in how we remember. Myths and stories, as we have seen, can carry memories across centuries, but their edges blur. A flood remembered by one generation becomes a punishment told by the next. A vanished land becomes a paradise lost, a moral tale, a legend. By the time thousands of years pass, what may have begun as memory becomes myth. This is not failure, it is how human minds preserve what they cannot explain. But it means that when we listen to myths of sunken lands or lost civilizations, we are hearing echoes, not direct accounts. The truth may be there, but it is wrapped in layers of symbolism that time has woven around it. Time also complicates our tools of discovery. Archaeology depends on layers, strata, of soil and stone that preserve the remains of the past. But those layers are fragile. They can be disturbed by earthquakes, floods, landslides, or the slow movements of the earth itself. A site that might have held evidence of something extraordinary could be destroyed long before we uncover it. Or it may lie buried so deeply that we never find it at all. We search only in small places, after all. The vastness of the earth means that the majority of ancient sites remain unknown, and many will never be found. And yet, there are reminders that time does not erase everything. A flint blade, a bone carving, a painting deep inside a cave can last for tens of thousands of years if the conditions are right. These small fragments are the reason we know the Ice Age was not empty. They tell us that people lived, created, dreamed. If such fragile things can endure, it is not unreasonable to wonder what larger things might also lie hidden, waiting for us to uncover them. The problem of time is not that it destroys everything, but that it leaves us only fragments, and those fragments can never tell the whole story. There is also a kind of humility that comes with facing this problem. We often speak as though our own civilization is the peak, the culmination of progress. But if time teaches us anything, it is that nothing lasts forever. Empires fall, cities vanish, languages fade, even stone monuments crumble. We may imagine that our satellites, our skyscrapers, our digital records will endure, but in the measure of millennia, they too are fragile. 10,000 years from now, what will remain of us? Perhaps only scattered traces in the soil, faint chemical signatures, or stories carried forward in forms we cannot predict. We, too, may one day become fragments in the puzzle of time, and those who come after us may wonder whether we ever truly existed. In this way, the problem of time is also an invitation. It asks us to see ourselves not as fixed, permanent beings, but as part of a flow, a rhythm of rise and fall, appearance and disappearance. It reminds us that the Ice Age was not only a background for survival, but a chapter in the same story we are still writing. And it suggests that if civilizations can vanish without a trace in the span of 12,000 years, then perhaps history is deeper, stranger, and more fragile than we think. So when we ask whether the Ice Age hid a lost civilization, we are not asking a simple yes or no question. We are asking whether our tools, our perspective, and our memory are enough to grasp what time has buried. The problem of time is that it keeps its secrets well. But the wonder is that even so, we catch glimpses, fragments of art, tools, myths that remind us we are not the beginning, nor likely the end, but part of something much larger, carried across the ages like a river flowing toward an unseen sea. 7. Traces in stone. Stone has always been the patient witness of history. Unlike wood or bone or fabric, it endures. It does not rot easily. It does not burn quickly. And though it may weather, it holds its shape far longer than anything else we build with. When we look back into the deep past, it is often stone that greets us first. Tools chipped from flint, carvings etched into walls, monuments raised from slabs. It is no surprise, then, that when we search for echoes of a possible Ice Age civilization, our gaze falls upon stone, for if anything were to remain from that distant time, it would be the traces left in rock. And yet, the puzzle is strange. We do find stone structures that defy our expectations of age and sophistication. Göbekli Tepe, in modern-day Turkey, is perhaps the most famous. There, buried beneath layers of soil, stand great T-shaped pillars carved with animals and symbols arranged in circles like a temple. These stones are more than 11,000 years old, predating farming and the rise of cities by millennia. Conventional history tells us that hunter-gatherers should not have been capable of building such things, and yet they did. The question is how? Were they inheriting traditions from something earlier, a memory carried through the end of the Ice Age, or did they simply leap forward in creativity, surprising us with a burst of ingenuity? Other sites whisper the same question. The stone walls of Jericho, some of the oldest known city fortifications, rise from a time when people were supposedly only beginning to settle. The megaliths of Malta, the dolmens of Europe, and the giant statues of Easter Island each add another layer of mystery. They are younger than the Ice Age, but they suggest a continuity, as though once humans learned to shape stone on a grand scale, they may have been reviving a practice older than we can prove. Perhaps the survivors on the shore, carrying memories of drowned coastlines, passed along the knowledge that stone was the material that endures. The traces in stone are not limited to monuments. Tools, too, reveal something remarkable. From blades shaped so finely they rival modern edges, to beads carved from hard rock, to intricate figurines of animals and humans, the craftsmanship of the Ice Age often surprises us. These are not crude or primitive works. They carry a sense of artistry and care, suggesting that the people who made them had time to create beyond survival, to devote energy to beauty and symbolism. Stone, in these cases, was not only a material of necessity, but of expression. It became the medium through which memory was carried forward. But there is another layer to consider. Nature too shapes stone. Waves carve cliffs, earthquakes fracture layers, volcanic flows build towering walls. Sometimes, what appears to be artificial may in fact be natural. And sometimes, what seems natural may hold the faint marks of human hands. This is why the traces are so difficult to interpret. Take the underwater terraces of Yonaguni in Japan. They look at first glance like vast stone steps perfectly aligned. Some argue they are the remnants of an ancient structure, perhaps a temple drowned by the rising seas after the Ice Age. Others insist they are natural formations, sculpted by tectonics and erosion. Without certainty, the site remains a riddle. The problem is that stone does not speak clearly. It hints, it suggests, it leaves us in the space between possibility and doubt. And yet, perhaps that is part of its power. The ambiguity invites us to imagine. If a civilization did rise during the Ice Age, we would expect stone to be its lasting voice. But would we recognize it if we saw it? Would we mistake it for natural cliffs, for scattered boulders, for terraces carved by water? Perhaps the traces are there already, hiding in plain sight, waiting for us to see them with new eyes. Stone also carries silence. Think of the caves at Lascaux or Chauvet, where paintings of animals cover the walls. The stone itself preserved them, protecting them from light and weather. When we stand there, we are standing in the same silence the artists once knew. The traces in stone are not only physical but emotional. They carry the weight of presence. To look at a carved figure or a painted bison is to feel, across thousands of years, the nearness of the hand that made it. It is a reminder that time does not fully erase connection. Through stone, we are still in conversation with the people of the Ice Age. What is striking is that stone seems to be chosen deliberately for permanence. Wood is easier to carve, clay is easier to shape, but stone endures. It is as though our ancestors knew, on some deep level, that if anything of them were to last, it would be what they made from rock. This is why we look to it for answers, and why we linger on the possibility that the stones we see may be more than they appear. Perhaps they are fragments of a forgotten story, half buried, half remembered, waiting for us to assemble them. Even if there was no great civilization in the Ice Age, the traces in stone remind us that human creativity and resilience are far older than we once believed. People who lived through cold and scarcity still found time to shape, to carve, to build. They carried within them the same impulse we carry now, to leave something behind, to be remembered, to make their mark upon the earth. That impulse is carved into the rock, and it whispers to us still. And if there was something more, if there were villages along the forgotten coastlines, if there were monuments now lost beneath the sea, then stone is our best hope of finding them. Somewhere under the waves, perhaps, lie walls and pillars, hidden for 12,000 years, waiting in silence. If they exist, they will be stone, the one material that keeps its secrets longer than any other. So we return, again and again, to the traces in stone. We walk among ruins, we dive into the sea, we study the cliffs and the terraces, searching for patterns. We do this not only to prove or disprove the existence of a lost civilization, but because stone speaks to something in us. It speaks of endurance, of memory, of the desire to leave a mark that outlasts time. And in that way, it reflects us back to ourselves, for we too leave traces in stone roads, walls, statues, hoping that someday, far in the future, someone will find them and know we were here. The Ice Age may have hidden its secrets well, but if any survive, they will be carved in stone. And when we stand before them, whether in caves or on seafloors, we will be standing not only in front of rock, but in front of memory, memory that has crossed the impossible span of time to reach us, faint but enduring, a whisper carved into the bones of the earth. 8. Life beneath the waves. When we look out over the ocean today, it feels like a boundary, a place that ends the land and begins the unknown. But during the Ice Age, those waters were much farther away. The seas were locked up in glaciers, pulled back to reveal great expanses of dry ground, plains and valleys that stretched outward where waves now roll. People and animals lived on those coasts, hunting, gathering, raising families. Then, as the ice melted and the seas rose, those places vanished beneath the waves. What we see now as a vast ocean was once a landscape alive, with footsteps, firelight and stories. The ocean has become an archive, one that holds within its depths the hidden record of those lost worlds. To imagine life beneath the waves is to imagine not only the animals that swim there now, but the lives that once thrived on the land that the ocean swallowed. Doggerland, stretching between Britain and Europe, was once a rich grassland dotted with rivers and lakes. It supported mammoths, deer, and the people who followed them. Now, it lies silent beneath the North Sea, its bones and artifacts buried under silt. Off the coast of India, vast cities may once have stood on plains that are now drowned. In Southeast Asia, islands that seem scattered today were connected by wide territories. Each of these drowned landscapes is not only a geological curiosity but a reminder that human history is incomplete without the chapters hidden underwater. Archaeologists have only begun to touch the edges of this underwater record. Using sonar, divers and submersibles, they have mapped valleys that look like riverbeds, terraces that resemble ancient fields, and formations that may be walls or streets. Off the coast of Japan, the Yonaguni Monument lies in silence, massive steps of stone descending into the sea. Some say it is natural, Others insist it is carved. Off the shores of India, sonar has revealed structures that resemble entire city blocks. In the Mediterranean, ruins of drowned villages lie just below the waves, preserved in the quiet of the sea. None of these sites has given us certainty, but each whispers the same thing, that life once filled the places where only water now flows. The difficulty is not only that the ocean hides these places, but that it changes them. Waves scatter stone, currents bury ruins under silt, salt water erodes what once stood tall. Evidence does not remain neat and visible, as it sometimes does on land. Instead, it drifts into fragments, into shadows on sonar scans, into shapes that may or may not be human-made. This makes the search both frustrating and haunting. We can sense that something is there, but the ocean keeps it out of reach. It is like trying to read a book whose pages are blurred, whose words have been smudged by time. And yet, there is a strange comfort in this as well. The ocean preserves as much as it erases. Beneath its surface, in layers of sediment, artifacts can remain untouched for thousands of years. Bones, tools, and even seeds have been found in such conditions, waiting for discovery. Entire landscapes have been mapped beneath the sea, showing us the outlines of rivers, forests, and hills that were once above water. It is as though the ocean has hidden a second Earth, parallel to the one we walk on, filled with silent reminders of what came before. To imagine life beneath the waves is also to imagine what it must have felt like to watch the waters rise. For the people of the Ice Age, it was not a slow, distant process, but a force that touched their lives directly. A valley where their ancestors had lived for generations might have flooded in the space of a lifetime. Fields where they had hunted could have vanished in a single season. Hills became islands. Islands became reefs. The sea was not only a boundary but an advancing presence, claiming more and more land with each passing century. Those who lived through it must have carried the memory like a scar, a story told again and again. When we hear flood myths today, we may be hearing the echoes of those voices, preserved not in stone but in story. There is another question, more speculative but worth wondering. If people did build along those ancient coasts, could they have created more than small villages? Could they have gathered in larger numbers, built monuments, experimented with farming or trade, even shaped societies that we might call civilizations? If so, their traces would now lie beneath the sea, out of reach for millennia. Perhaps what we call the first civilizations, those of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley, were not truly the first, but only the first to survive on land. The real beginnings may lie drowned in silence, erased from the visible world, but preserved in memory and possibility. And then there is the thought of how fragile our own world is by comparison. Most of our great cities today are coastal New York, Tokyo, London, Shanghai. If sea levels were to rise 100 meters, as they did when the Ice Age ended, how much of our civilization would remain? In a few thousand years, would the survivors inland remember us as the people of drowned cities, telling stories of towers and lights that vanished beneath the waves? Would future archaeologists debate whether the strange shapes found under the ocean were natural or human-made? The life beneath the waves may not only be a story of the past, but a mirror of our own possible future. To explore the ocean is to explore memory. Every dive, every sonar scan, every fragment brought up from the seafloor adds a piece to the puzzle. And yet, the ocean keeps its secrets well. It is vast, deep, and ever-changing. We may never recover all that has been lost, but the knowledge that it is there, that beneath the waves lie entire landscapes once alive, changes how we see the world. The ocean is not only water, it is history, folded and hidden, waiting patiently. And so, when we imagine life beneath the waves, we are not only imagining ruins or artifacts, we are imagining fires burning on coastlines that no longer exist, children running through fields now buried under water, voices rising in song or story on shores now drowned. We are imagining that the ocean we see today is layered with memory, holding within it the invisible traces of lives as real as our own. Whether or not a great civilization was hidden there, the truth remains. The sea is filled with forgotten worlds, and by wondering about them, we allow them to live again, if only in the quiet of our thoughts. 9. The Great Melt. There are moments in Earth's history when change moves like a slow river, carving away at mountains over millions of years, and there are moments when it comes like a flood, sweeping everything before it. The end of the last ice age was one of those floods not only in the literal sense of rising seas, but in the broader sense of transformation. For tens of thousands of years, the world had been locked in cold silence, its rhythms tied to the cycles of glaciers and the migrations of herds. Then, around 12,000 years ago, warmth began to spread. The glaciers retreated, valleys filled with water, coastlines redrew themselves in a matter of centuries. It was the Great Melt, and for the people living then, it must have felt like the earth itself was breaking open into something new. Imagine standing in a valley that your family has called home for generations. Rivers flow steadily, herds gather in the distance, and the land feels eternal. Then, slowly at first, the river grows wider. Floods come more often, each one higher than the last. Within a few decades, the valley is no longer safe. What was once meadow becomes swamp, then lake, then sea. Hills that seemed permanent become islands. Finally, even those are gone, and the horizon is nothing but water. From our vantage in history, it is easy to see this as geology. But for those who lived through it, it must have been a crisis of memory, of belonging, of identity. The world they knew was ending, and a new one was taking shape before their eyes. The Great Melt was not gentle everywhere. There were pulses of sudden warming events known as meltwater pulses, when glaciers collapsed and seas rose rapidly, sometimes by several meters within a human lifetime. To us, that might sound abstract, but imagine watching the shoreline creep inland every year, eating fields, forests, and homes. For people who measured time by seasons and stories, it would have felt like the sea was alive, relentless, hungering for land. These memories, passed down through generations, may be the source of flood myths that still ripple across cultures today. The consequences of the melt reached far beyond drowned coastlines. As the glaciers retreated, climates shifted. Grasslands turned into forests. Deserts expanded in some regions and shrank in others. Rivers carved new paths as meltwater surged, creating fertile plains in some places and devastating floods in others. The land itself was restless, adjusting to the new weight of the world as the ice sheets disappeared. In this changing landscape, humans had to adapt quickly. Where once they had hunted mammoths across frozen steppes, they now found themselves in forests filled with deer. Where they had fished in shallow rivers, they now faced lakes and seas. The rhythms of life shifted, and with them, the possibilities for survival and growth. Some archaeologists believe that this period of change may have been the spark for the great transformations that followed. Agriculture emerged soon after the Ice Age ended, when climates stabilized enough for farming to take root. Permanent settlements appeared, then cities, then civilizations. It is tempting to see this as progress, as though the end of the Ice Age unlocked the potential of humanity. But what if it was not a beginning, but a continuation? What if the survivors of drowned coasts carried fragments of knowledge inland, planting the seeds of what we now call civilization? The Great Melt, then, would not have been a clean slate, but a great scattering, a dispersal of people and ideas that had already begun to take shape. There is also the haunting possibility of loss. If people had built villages, monuments, or even cities along those Ice Age coasts, the melt may have erased them completely. Whole chapters of human history could have vanished in a few centuries, leaving only the faintest echoes in myth and memory. When we wonder about lost civilizations, it is not because we want to replace what we know, but because we sense that the ocean may be hiding stories we will never fully recover. The Great Melt was not only an ending and a beginning, it was also an erasure. And yet, the melt was also a renewal. The floods that drowned valleys also created fertile deltas. The rivers that shifted carved new paths that humans would follow for thousands of years. The climates that warmed allowed agriculture to flourish. In the long view, the melt was both destruction and creation. It swept away the old, but it also prepared the ground for the new. Civilizations rose in the shadows of the Ice Age's retreat, shaped by the opportunities and challenges it left behind. To place ourselves in that moment is to feel both fear and wonder. Imagine watching the sea swallow your home, knowing you must leave behind the graves of your ancestors, the places where your stories were rooted. Then imagine travelling inland, finding new ground, and beginning again. The resilience of those who lived through the Great Melt is astonishing. They were not only survivors but adapters, carrying their memories forward, shaping new lives in landscapes that had only just been revealed. There is something humbling in realizing that our world is built on the aftermath of such change. The coastlines we know are temporary. The rivers we depend on were carved by floods. The fertile lands where agriculture began were gifts of the melt. Even our myths, the stories of floods and vanished lands, may be inherited memories of that time. The Great Melt shaped not only the physical world but the human imagination. It taught us that the earth can transform in ways that feel absolute, that what seems eternal can vanish within a lifetime. And perhaps it carries a lesson for us still. We too live in a world where ice is melting, seas are rising, and coastlines are shifting. To think about the great melt of the past is to see our present with new eyes. It reminds us that change is not an exception but a constant, that the land beneath our feet is not fixed but always in motion. It reminds us that survival is not only about enduring, but about carrying memory forward, about adapting to the new while remembering the old. The Great Melt was not just a geological event. It was a human event, experienced in fear, in loss, in resilience, in renewal. Its waters drowned worlds, but they also shaped the one we now inhabit. To remember it is to stand at the edge of the ocean and imagine what lies beneath, to feel the patience of time, and to know that the story of humanity is not only written on land, but in the rise and fall of seas. 10. Fire and flood in memory. When we speak of ancient times, we often rely on ruins and artifacts to guide us. But there is another archive, less tangible, yet just as enduring: memory. Across the world, in cultures separated by oceans and mountains, stories have been passed down of floods, fires, and the reshaping of the earth. They are myths, yes, but myths are not only fantasy. They are containers of memory, shaped by the imagination, carried across generations like embers kept alive in the dark. And when we listen to them carefully, with patience and curiosity, they may reveal fragments of truths, echoes of the great changes that ended the Ice Age, remembered not in stone but in story. Nearly every culture has a flood myth. The story of Noah in the Hebrew Bible is perhaps the most famous, with its image of a righteous man building an ark to save his family and the animals of the world from waters that rose to cover the earth. But this story is not unique. In Mesopotamia, far older tales tell of Utnapishtim, who also built a vessel to survive a great flood, guided by the gods. In India, the legend of Manu speaks of a man who was warned by a fish of an approaching deluge, and who built a boat to preserve life. In the Pacific Islands, in the Americas, in Australia, and in Africa, variations abound. Floods that swallowed lands, people who escaped on rafts or climbed mountains, gods or spirits who sent the waters as punishment or renewal. What is striking is not only the similarity of these stories, but their persistence. They have survived for thousands of years, carried in song, in ritual, in whispered teaching. For people without writing, story was the vessel of memory, more durable than wood, more lasting than clay. A flood story told around a fire could travel across generations, preserving the memory of rising waters long after the land itself was gone. To us, they appear as myth. To those who first told them, they were history. They were the way of saying, once the waters rose, and we endured. The presence of fire in these myths is equally compelling. Fire, like flood, is both destroyer and creator. In many traditions, the world is said to have ended in fire before being born anew. Some stories speak of the sky burning, of stars falling, of lands consumed. Scientists today know that around 12,000 years ago, as the Ice Age waned, there were dramatic climatic shifts, sudden warming, massive floods from melting glaciers, perhaps even impacts from comets or asteroids. Fires would have swept across drying landscapes, ignited by lightning or by the chaos of change. For those who lived through it, the memory of flames racing across forests or grasslands would have been as terrifying as the memory of rising seas. Together, fire and flood became symbols of transformation. They were ways of expressing that the world had been remade, that what once was had been erased, and something new had begun. Myths capture this truth not in the language of geology or climate science, but in imagery that the human heart understands. A flood sent by gods, a fire from the sky, a world drowned or burned so that a new one could rise. They are poetic ways of remembering real change. But myths also serve another purpose. They are not only about memory, they are about meaning. A flood, to those who endured it, was not only a physical disaster, it was a spiritual crisis. Why had the waters risen? Why had their homes been taken? To weave those questions into story was to find a kind of order in chaos. The flood was punishment for corruption. The fire was a cleansing of the earth. These interpretations gave suffering a shape, made it possible to endure. And so, the memory of disaster was not only preserved, but transformed into a lesson, a warning, a reminder that life is fragile, that the world can change in an instant, and that survival requires humility. When we look at these myths now, from the vantage of history, it is tempting to separate the symbolic from the real. But perhaps that is a false division. Perhaps the symbolic is the real, seen through the lens of memory and imagination. A flood myth may not describe an actual event exactly as it happened, but it may preserve the memory of seas rising at the end of the Ice Age. A fire myth may not recall a literal burning of the world, but it may echo the wildfires that swept across landscapes during sudden climate shifts. The blending of memory and meaning is what gives myths their endurance. Facts alone fade. Stories endure. The flood and fire myths also remind us of how fragile our own memory is. We write books, record films, store data in machines, but these too will not last forever. In time, they will crumble, decay, or be erased. What may endure of us are the stories we tell, the myths we pass down, the symbolic truths we embed in culture. Just as the memory of the Ice Age's end reached us through myths of fire and flood, so too might our own age be remembered, not in precise detail, but in stories of towers, of machines, of the great transformations we are living through now. There is a quiet wonder in imagining this continuity. The people of the Ice Age, facing floods and fires, told stories to carry memory forward. We too tell stories about change, about survival, about the fragility of our world. In that way, we are not separate from them. We are part of the same stream, flowing through time, shaping memory into myth, so that even when the details are lost, the essence remains. The fire and flood in memory are not only about the past, they are reminders for us now. They whisper that the earth is not fixed, that change is constant, that what seems permanent can vanish. They remind us that survival is not only about strength, but about the ability to remember, to adapt, to carry meaning across generations. And they invite us to wonder whether, beneath the myths we tell, there are truths waiting quietly to be heard. So, when we hear of Noah's Ark, or Utnapishtim's vessel, or Manu's boat, we can listen not only as stories of gods and heroes, but as echoes of real human voices, long ago, remembering the waters that rose, the fires that burned, the world that was lost and the world that was born anew. To listen in this way is to honour their memory, to acknowledge that we too are keepers of fire and flood, shaping the memory of our own time for those yet to come. 11. The question of civilization. When we talk about civilization, we often imagine certain hallmarks: cities with streets and walls, temples rising in stone, writing etched into clay or carved into tablets, agriculture spreading across fertile fields. Civilization, in our minds, is tied to permanence, to the idea of human beings shaping the land in organized and enduring ways. But when we step back and ask what civilization truly means, the question becomes less clear. Is it defined only by those markers we can see and measure? Or could there have been other forms of civilization, older and less familiar, that left little trace? When we ask whether the Ice Age hid a lost civilization, this becomes the heart of the matter, the question of what counts as civilization at all. Archaeologists usually mark the beginning of civilization around 10,000 years ago, when agriculture began to take root in the Fertile Crescent, when people settled into permanent villages, and when monumental sites like Göbekli Tepe began to appear. But this definition may be too narrow, bound by our own expectations of what civilization looks like. After all, people were shaping their environments, telling stories, and creating art long before farming or writing existed. The cave paintings of Lascaux, the carvings of Venus figurines, the tools crafted with precision all suggest societies rich in culture and meaning, even if they did not build cities. Can we really say that these people were not civilized? The word civilization itself comes from the Latin civitas, meaning city. But perhaps this is only one kind of civilization, the kind that leaves behind walls and streets. There may be other kinds, less tied to stone and soil, more tied to memory and movement. Imagine a people whose civilization was carried not in buildings but in stories, rituals, and oral traditions. Imagine a society organized not around permanent settlements but around seasonal cycles, moving with herds, with rivers, with stars. Such a civilization would leave fewer ruins, but it might be no less complex, no less meaningful. Its wisdom might be encoded in myths, in art, in ways of life rather than monuments. If such civilizations existed along the coasts of the Ice Age, their traces may now lie hidden beneath the ocean. Villages of wood and reed, towns of clay and thatch, even monuments of stone could have been drowned and eroded. Unlike the pyramids or ziggurats that endure in deserts, these would have been claimed by water and time. Their memory may survive only in the stories we now call myths, in the sudden leaps of knowledge that appeared after the Ice Age ended, in the mysteries of sites like Göbekli Tepe that seemed too advanced for their time. This raises a deeper question. What if our definition of civilization blinds us to its earlier forms? We search for walls and writing, for agriculture and monuments, but what if the first civilizations were organized differently? What if they valued other things balanced with the land? Oral memory, symbolic ritual over permanence in stone? Would we even recognize them if we found them? Or would we dismiss their traces as primitive, simply because they do not fit our expectations? Consider, too, that civilization is often seen as progress, as a line moving upward from simple beginnings to greater complexity. But history does not move in straight lines. It rises and falls, advances and retreats. Empires collapse, knowledge is lost, then rediscovered. It is possible that civilizations before the Ice Age rose and fell in the same way, leaving little behind but whispers. We may not be the first. We may only be the latest in a cycle far older than we realize. There is also the question of fragility. If our civilization were to vanish tomorrow, what would remain in 10,000 years? Skyscrapers would crumble, steel would rust, books would decay, computers would dissolve, perhaps only a few stone monuments would survive, along with subtle chemical signatures in the soil. If future archaeologists dug into our world, they might find fragments and wonder whether we truly existed at the scale we do now. If this is true for us, why not for those who may have lived before? Civilization may not be defined by what is left behind, but by what was lived in its time. This is not to say that a great Ice Age civilization certainly existed. It is to say that the absence of obvious ruins does not prove that none did. It is to remind us that civilization is a broader, more flexible concept than we often allow. To imagine that people 12 or 15,000 years ago could have organized themselves in ways we do not fully understand is not far-fetched. It is humble. It is acknowledging that the human story may be deeper and more varied than the narrow frame we give it. So the question of civilization becomes not only a question of the past, but a question of perspective. What does it mean to be civilized? Is it about building monuments, or is it about weaving meaning into life? Is it about permanence or about resilience? Is it about stone and writing or about memory and imagination? The people of the Ice Age, painting in caves, carving figures, telling stories of floods and fire, may not have built cities, but they built something else: continuity. They built culture, connection, the foundations of what we still carry. Perhaps that, too, deserves the name of civilization. And if there was more, if along the forgotten coastlines, people gathered in larger numbers, built towns now lost, created rituals and knowledge that we inherited unknowingly, then civilization stretches even further back, into the shadows of time. The Ice Age may not have been a waiting room for history, but history itself, lived fully, with all the richness and struggle of human life. The question of civilization, then, is not about whether the Ice Age hid a lost one, but about how we choose to define it. If we define civilization only by what survives in stone, we may miss the deeper truth. Civilization is not only walls and cities. It is the act of living together, of shaping meaning, of leaving traces for the future, however fragile. By that measure, perhaps civilization is older than we think, older than the pyramids, older than the first cities, older even than the great melt that drowned the coasts. Perhaps it is as old as humanity itself, always adapting, always finding ways to endure, even when the world itself was changing beyond recognition. And so, when we ask the question of civilization, we are not only asking about the past, we are asking about ourselves. What will remain of us? What will future generations call civilization? Will they point to our cities and our machines? Or will they look deeper, to our stories, our art, our memory? The Ice Age may have hidden civilizations we cannot see, but it also reminds us that the essence of civilization is not only in what is built, but in what is carried through time, through change, through memory. 12. Technology that vanishes. When we think of technology, we picture the things closest to us. Machines of steel and glass, satellites orbiting above, networks that stretch invisibly across the world. It feels permanent, as though what we have built is so advanced it could never be forgotten. But if history teaches anything, it is that nothing we make is immune to time. Even the strongest towers eventually fall, the sharpest tools eventually dull, and the brightest lights eventually fade. The question of technology, especially in the deep past, is not whether it existed, but how much of it remains visible to us now. When we wonder whether the Ice Age hid a lost civilization, we must also wonder whether its technology, if it had any, could have vanished so completely that we no longer recognize it. Consider our own world as an example. Imagine, for a moment, that humanity disappeared tomorrow. Our cities would stand, at least for a while, but without maintenance, glass would shatter, steel would rust, concrete would crumble. Within a few centuries, trees would rise through streets, rivers would reclaim their courses, and animals would roam where skyscrapers once stood. In 1,000 years, the ruins would be faint but still there. In 10,000, almost everything would be gone, except perhaps fragments of stone and a few scattered artifacts. In 20,000, the span of time since the Ice Age, the Earth would have erased nearly all of it. Our satellites would have fallen, our machines would have decayed, our knowledge would survive only in what nature allowed to remain. This thought experiment is not about erasing our pride, but about realizing how fragile technology truly is. The things we consider advanced are often made from materials that do not endure. Plastic, metal, circuitry all dissolve under the patience of time. Stone endures, clay endures, bone sometimes endures, but the rest is fleeting. If an Ice Age civilization had developed technologies, tools of wood, machines of bronze, or even inventions, we cannot easily imagine those things may have long since vanished. The absence of evidence does not mean the absence of existence. It may simply mean the evidence was too fragile to last. Archaeology shows us this again and again. Entire cultures once flourished, leaving little behind but scattered fragments. We know of the Indus Valley civilization, for example, not through towering monuments like the pyramids, but through the faint outlines of cities preserved in mud brick foundations. Had the rivers shifted differently, had the soil buried those places more completely, we might never have known they were there. How many others existed and left nothing? How many rose and fell along coastlines now drowned, their technologies swallowed by salt water and silt? There is also the matter of recognition. Even if something survived, would we know what it was? A stone pillar can be recognized as human-made, but what about a chemical trace in the soil, a pattern in minerals, or an unusual formation beneath the sea? We might mistake advanced technology for natural phenomena, simply because we do not expect to find it. The puzzle of the past is not only about what is missing, but about what we might be overlooking. Some thinkers have even asked whether an advanced civilization could have existed on Earth millions of years ago, far before humans, and whether the only trace left would be in subtle chemical layers in the rocks. That idea, sometimes called the Silurian hypothesis, is speculative, but it raises an important point. The deeper we go into time, the less visible technology becomes. If that is true for millions of years, it is also true for tens of thousands. The Ice Age may not be so far behind us, geologically speaking, but it is far enough that anything delicate would be long gone. This leads us to a humbling realization. Technology is not timeless. It is not permanent. It is a tool of the moment, built to serve, but rarely built to endure. What lasts are the simplest things, the stone tools, the carvings, the fire pits. When we find these, we sometimes underestimate the people who made them, imagining them as primitive because their tools look simple. But perhaps the simplicity is only what survived. Perhaps there were other things, lost to time, that would change our picture completely if we could see them. It is also worth remembering that technology does not always mean machines. It can mean knowledge, the ways of farming, ways of sailing, ways of navigating by the stars. These are technologies of the mind, carried in memory and story rather than in objects. If such knowledge existed during the Ice Age, it might not have left behind any physical trace at all. And yet, fragments of it may have been carried forward, embedded in myths, reappearing in sudden leaps of human progress after the seas rose. Technology, in this sense, is not only what is built, but what is remembered. There is a strange comfort in this thought. Even if civilizations rose and fell before us, even if their technologies vanished, perhaps something of them remains in us still. The sudden flowering of agriculture, the building of monumental stone sites like Göbekli Tepe, and the ancient understanding of stars and seasons, these may not have been invented from nothing. They may have been seeds carried forward, scattered by survivors of the Great Melt, planted again in new soil. The technologies that vanished physically may still live in the continuity of human thought, and so, the question of vanished technology is not only about the past, it is also about us. We imagine our own world as secure, permanent, enduring. But if time can erase everything from the Ice Age except fragments of stone, it can erase us too. Our skyscrapers, our satellites, our networks, these are only temporary. What will remain are the simplest traces, and perhaps the stories we manage to carry forward. We are not immune to the problem of time. We are part of it. To think of technology that vanishes is to think of fragility, but it is also to think of continuity. What is lost may still leave echoes. What is erased may still inspire. The Ice Age may or may not have hidden a great civilization, but if it did, its technology would have been fleeting, as ours will be. What remains is the human impulse to create, to adapt, to pass knowledge forward. That, more than machines or monuments, may be the true technology, the one that endures beyond the reach of time. 13. The ocean as archive. The ocean is often described as a boundary, the end of the land and the beginning of something vast and unknowable. But when we think of it as an archive, the picture changes. Beneath its waves lies not only the life of fish and whales, but also the silent record of worlds that once stood above water. During the Ice Age, seas were far lower than they are today, and the lands where countless people may have lived are now hidden beneath hundreds of feet of water. Those lost coastlines, drowned valleys, and forgotten plains are not gone. They are preserved in the quiet of the ocean, waiting in the layers of sand and silt. The ocean, in this way, becomes the greatest library of human history, though one we have only barely begun to open. If we could drain the seas for a moment and walk across their floors, what would we see? We would find riverbeds, where salmon once swam and people once fished. We would see hills that were once islands, now buried under waves. We might walk through plains where mammoths grazed, where children played, where fires glowed in the night. We might even find the faint outlines of walls, of foundations, of places built by hands long ago. But the ocean covers it all now, a blanket of water that both hides and protects. What it conceals, it also preserves, sealing away artifacts that sunlight, wind, and rain would have long since erased on land. This is why underwater archaeology is so haunting. Each dive, each scan, each glimpse beneath the seafloor has the potential to reveal something we thought was lost forever. Off the coast of India, sonar has traced patterns that resemble entire cities. In the Mediterranean, divers have found the remains of drowned towns, their streets still visible, their walls intact. In Japan, the Yonaguni monument lies beneath the waves, massive steps and terraces that seem almost too regular to be natural. And in northern Europe, fragments of tools and bones have been dredged up from the North Sea, reminders that Doggerland was once alive with people and animals. These discoveries are only fragments, but they remind us that the ocean is not empty, it is filled with memory. Yet the ocean is also a difficult archive to read. Its waters shift constantly, scattering evidence, burying it under layers of silt. Currents carry stones and sands, reshaping what lies beneath. Salt corrodes, waves erode, storms scatter. Unlike the dry silence of deserts or caves, where artifacts can remain untouched for millennia, the sea is restless. It both preserves and erases, making the search for the past a delicate, uncertain task. When we scan the ocean floor, we see shadows and outlines, but the details are blurred, as though the pages of the archive have been smudged by water. Still, there is wonder in imagining what lies beneath. Entire landscapes may be waiting there, preserved with more clarity than we expect. Just as Pompeii was frozen in time by volcanic ash, so too might parts of Doggerland or Beringia be preserved under layers of sediment, untouched since the seas claimed them. There may be tools, carvings, even settlements waiting for us to uncover, quiet witnesses of a chapter of human history that has so far been invisible. The challenge is reaching them, not only with technology but with imagination, seeing them not as impossible, but as part of the broader story of humanity. The ocean as archive also reminds us of how much we have forgotten. For every fragment found beneath the sea, how many others lie undiscovered? How many are too deep, too buried, too fragile to recover? The scale of what is hidden is immense. More than 2/3 of the Earth is ocean, and most of it has never been explored in detail. The drowned landscapes of the Ice Age alone stretch across millions of square kilometers. Even if we searched for centuries, we would find only pieces. The ocean keeps its secrets well, revealing them only in glimpses. And yet, perhaps that is what makes it so powerful. The knowledge that the ocean holds forgotten worlds changes how we look at it. No longer just water, it becomes time itself, stretched out across depth. To stand on a shore and watch the waves is to realize that beneath them lie valleys where people once stood, that the sea is layered not only with currents but with memory. The ocean is a presence, vast and quiet, that holds more of our story than the land ever could. There is also a mirror here, a reflection of our own time. Today, our greatest cities are coastal. If the seas rise again, as they are rising now, much of our civilization will be swallowed just as the Ice Age coastlines were. One day, perhaps, the ocean will archive us as well. Future generations, if they exist, may dive into what was once New York, London, or Shanghai, finding fragments of stone and steel buried in silt. They will wonder about us as we now wonder about those who came before. The ocean will have preserved what it chose, erasing the rest. This is the strange paradox of the sea. It hides, it erases, and yet it preserves. It is both the enemy of memory and its greatest ally. We owe much of what we have lost to its depths, but we also owe the hope of discovery to the same depths. Without the ocean, much of the Ice Age past would have been destroyed completely. With the ocean, it remains in shadow, waiting for us to look closer. And so, the ocean as archive is not simply a metaphor. It is a truth written in waves and tides. Beneath the surface lies a library of forgotten worlds, sealed away not in books or scrolls, but in sand and stone and silence. We may never read all its pages, but the knowledge that they exist invites us to wonder, to imagine, to respect the depth of time and the fragility of memory. The ocean is not only the present, it is the past, waiting patiently beneath the waves. 14. Human restarts. The story of humanity is not a single line, steadily rising from simplicity to complexity. It is a story of cycles, of rises and falls, of growth followed by collapse, and of knowledge forgotten only to be rediscovered again. When we look at history, even in the few thousand years we know well, we see this pattern clearly. Empires have risen with grandeur and confidence, only to fall into silence. Cities once vibrant have turned into ruins, covered in dust and vines. Languages have bloomed, flourished, and then disappeared, leaving only faint inscriptions for us to puzzle over. Civilization is not continuous, it is fragile, and it often restarts. To wonder about the Ice Age as a possible cradle of lost civilizations is to wonder whether one of these restarts lies hidden so far back in time that we no longer see it. Take the fall of Rome as an example. For centuries, it was the center of power in Europe, a hub of law, engineering, and culture. Its aqueducts carried water, its roads stretched across continents, its armies held vast territories together. And then, in what felt like the blink of an eye in historical terms, it collapsed. Cities shrank, populations fell, knowledge scattered. The skills of building aqueducts and roads, of producing complex concrete, of organizing such vast structures, were lost for generations. Europe entered a period often called the Dark Ages, where much of what Rome had created was forgotten. If such a collapse can happen in only a few centuries, what might have been lost in the thousands of years between the Ice Age and the first recorded civilizations? The same is true elsewhere. The great Maya cities of Central America, filled with temples and astronomy, fell silent long before Europeans arrived. The Indus Valley civilization, with its intricate urban planning and drainage systems, disappeared so completely that its script has never been deciphered. The once great cities of Mesopotamia are now little more than dust under desert winds. Each of these civilizations was advanced in its own way, each left behind signs of brilliance, and yet each vanished, leaving us to piece together fragments. History is filled with restarts. The question is not whether collapse happens, it always does, but how much is remembered and how much is lost. Now, extend this pattern further back. Imagine a civilization along an Ice Age coastline thriving in a world colder but stable. Perhaps they built with wood, clay, or stone. Perhaps they lived in organized communities. Perhaps they developed technologies that were fragile yet effective. Then, as the glaciers melted and seas rose, their lands vanished beneath the waves. Survivors fled inland, carrying what knowledge they could, but with time, much was forgotten. What survived was not the whole, but fragments, stories of floods, rituals tied to stars, perhaps the seeds of farming, or the inspiration for monuments like Göbekli Tepe. If this happened, it would not be the first restart in human history, it would simply be the oldest, one that time has nearly erased. There is a haunting humility in this thought. We often imagine ourselves as the pinnacle of history, as though the past was always leading to us. But the pattern of human restarts tells us otherwise. We are not the inevitable outcome. We are simply one of many attempts, one of many chapters. Civilizations rise, they shine brightly, and then they vanish, leaving only enough behind to remind us they were there. If we see this pattern clearly in the last 5,000 years, why should we assume it did not exist earlier, in the deep shadows of the Ice Age? The restarts are also reminders of resilience. When Rome fell, people did not disappear. They adapted. They carried fragments of knowledge forward, planting seeds that would grow centuries later in the Renaissance. When the Maya cities fell silent, their descendants survived, carrying culture and memory into new forms. When the Indus Valley was abandoned, its people spread, and some of their practices, weights, measures, agricultural techniques, lived on in other regions. Collapse does not mean the end. It means transformation. It means that the thread of humanity continues, even when the fabric of civilization unravels. And so, when we think of the Ice Age, we might imagine that its possible civilizations did not vanish entirely, but restarted. Perhaps the survivors carried seeds of memory inland, to safer ground. Perhaps those seeds sprouted later, in the fertile valleys of Mesopotamia, in the stone circles of Anatolia, in the myths of floods and fire that appear across cultures. Perhaps our own story is already layered with the forgotten chapters of civilizations that rose before history began. This idea changes how we see ourselves. If civilizations restart, then our own is not immune. We live in a world of towering cities, of vast technology, of global reach, but so did others in their own way, and just as they fell, we may one day fall. What will remain of us? What fragments will survive? What seeds will be carried forward into the next restart? To think about human restarts is to realize that permanence is an illusion, that fragility is the true constant, and that resilience is what endures. But there is also beauty in this cycle. Each restart brings something new, something reshaped by memory and loss. The collapse of one civilization clears the way for another to grow. The forgotten lessons of the past sometimes return in surprising ways, reborn in new forms. Humanity does not simply repeat itself, it evolves through forgetting and remembering, through collapse and renewal. The restarts are not failures, they are part of the rhythm of our story. And so, perhaps the Ice Age held one of the earliest restarts. Perhaps a civilization rose, lived, and vanished beneath the great melt, leaving behind only whispers. Perhaps its fragments live in us still, in our myths, in our art, in our sudden leaps of knowledge that seem to come from nowhere. Whether or not we ever find proof, the pattern of human restarts makes the possibility not only imaginable but almost expected. The Earth has erased much, but the cycle remains, reminding us that our story is not a straight line but a spiral, turning through time, always beginning again. 15. Clues in DNA. If the Earth itself is an archive, then so too are our bodies. Written into every cell is a story, a record not of monuments or tools, but of survival, migration, and memory carried in flesh. DNA is more than a sequence of molecules. It is a kind of living library, one that stretches back through time, preserving echoes of the journeys our ancestors made. When we speak of lost civilizations and forgotten worlds, we often look to stone and soil. But perhaps some of the clues lie not in ruins, but in us. Scientists studying genetics have discovered that human beings today carry traces of ancient encounters. Within us are fragments of Neanderthal DNA, reminders of the times when our ancestors met and mingled with other human species. In certain populations, there are traces of Denisovan DNA as well, evidence of another branch of humanity now long vanished. These genetic memories remind us that the story of humans is not a neat line, but a braided river, with streams that join, diverge, and disappear. They also remind us that survival leaves marks, not only in tools and art, but in the code that shapes who we are. During the Ice Age, humanity endured what geneticists call bottlenecks, periods when the population shrank dramatically, often due to harsh climates or catastrophic events. These bottlenecks left scars in our DNA, reducing diversity, compressing the record of who we were. But they also tell us that small groups survived, carried the torch of humanity through the cold, and gave rise to all who came after. In a sense, every one of us alive today is descended from survivors of the Ice Age, people who endured hunger, cold, and change. The clues of their endurance are written into us, whether we recognize them or not. This leads to a haunting question. If there had been an organized civilization during the Ice Age, something larger than scattered tribes, something with shared knowledge and culture, would its memory remain in DNA? Not in the sense of buildings or inventions, but in the survival of its people. If those people were wiped out entirely, their genes would be lost, their story erased. But if some survived, fragments of their genetic legacy would live on, hidden within us. We may not recognize it as the trace of a civilization, but it would be there nonetheless, an invisible inheritance. Even without evidence of a lost civilization, DNA reveals remarkable things. It shows us the migrations of our ancestors, the paths they took across continents, the ways they adapted to new environments. Some groups developed genes to digest milk, others to survive at high altitudes, others to resist certain diseases. These are not just biological facts, they are cultural clues, signs of how people lived, what they ate, where they traveled, and how they endured. DNA is not only a record of biology, but of life itself. It tells us that the Ice Age was not empty, but full of human resilience, diversity, and adaptation. There is also the mystery of memory that cannot be measured in DNA, but that feels tied to it. Some scientists speculate about genetic memory, the idea that certain responses or fears may be inherited, carried unconsciously from one generation to another. Whether or not this is true in a literal sense, there is something compelling in imagining that our bodies carry echoes of floods, fires, migrations, and struggles long past. When myths of sunken lands and great floods appear in cultures around the world, are they only stories? Or are they reflections of experiences so profound they left an imprint, not only in memory but in the very way we are shaped? If we think of ourselves as archives, then we are also vessels of continuity. Even if civilizations rose and fell before recorded history, their people may still be alive in us, their genetic threads woven into our own. Perhaps their technologies and stories were lost, but their survival ensured ours. In that way, their civilization, however we define it, did not vanish completely. It lives on, hidden in our blood, invisible but real. This perspective also invites humility about our own time. We imagine that what defines us most are our inventions, our cities, our technologies. But perhaps what will matter most in the far future are the same things that mattered in the Ice Age: survival, adaptation, the ability to endure change. If our own civilization were to fall, the skyscrapers and satellites would fade, but our DNA would carry forward. Our descendants would inherit the code that tells of who we were, even if they knew nothing of our machines. Just as we inherit fragments from Neanderthals and Denisovans, so too might they inherit fragments of us. The truest legacy may not be what we build, but what we pass on in ourselves. Clues in DNA are quiet, often invisible to the naked eye. They do not impress like pyramids or temples, yet they carry truths deeper than any monument. They remind us that survival is the core of civilization, that resilience is the thread that ties us to the past. They whisper that we are not only individuals but the culmination of countless lives lived before us, lives that endured cold, hunger, and uncertainty. So, when we wonder whether the Ice Age hid a lost civilization, perhaps the answer is already inside us, not in ruins we can uncover, but in the blood that flows through our veins, the code that shapes us. Civilization is more than monuments. It is the act of carrying forward, of enduring, of remembering in ways we cannot always name. If an Ice Age civilization did exist, its legacy may not be found in stone or metal, but in us, in the quiet language of DNA, the ultimate archive of survival. 16. The ghosts of knowledge. Knowledge has a way of lingering, even when its origins are forgotten. It drifts like a ghost through time, passed from hand to hand, often without anyone realizing how old it truly is. We see this in our own world when ideas resurface after centuries, when inventions appear in one culture, though their roots lie in another long vanished, or when stories echo themes that seem older than the language they are spoken in. If civilizations did rise before the end of the Ice Age, then perhaps what remains of them is not stone or metal, but knowledge shadows of understanding, carried forward into later times, haunting the history we know. Consider the sudden appearance of agriculture around 10,000 years ago. To the traditional view, this was the moment humans shifted from nomadic hunting and gathering to farming and settlement. But agriculture did not emerge in only one place. It appeared independently in several regions: the Fertile Crescent, China, Mesoamerica, and the Andes, each discovering in their own way how to cultivate plants and domesticate animals. Was this coincidence? Or was it the resurfacing of an older knowledge, remembered dimly and adapted anew? Perhaps when the Great Melt forced people inland, they carried with them seeds, literal seeds, but also the metaphorical seeds of memory, knowledge of plants, of cycles, of cultivation. When the earth grew warmer and more stable, that memory blossomed again. The same question arises with monuments. Sites like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, or the megalithic circles of Europe, appear as sudden bursts of sophistication, as though people leapt from simple shelters to vast ritual centers overnight. But knowledge does not usually work this way. It builds, it accumulates. What if those sudden leaps were not leaps at all, but survivals? What if the builders were carrying with them traditions from coastlines now drowned, continuing practices that had been interrupted by rising seas? The stones may be new, but the ideas could be older, ghosts of knowledge reborn in new soil. Astronomy offers another haunting example. Ancient cultures around the world tracked the stars with precision. The builders of Stonehenge aligned their monument with the solstices. The Maya mapped the cycles of Venus. Egyptian temples were oriented to the rising of Sirius. These practices are often seen as the mark of later civilizations, but what if their roots stretch back into the Ice Age? For nomadic hunters, the stars were guides, telling them when seasons would change, when herds would move, when rivers would flood. If that knowledge deepened in coastal civilizations that are now lost, then its survival in later cultures may be a faint echo of those earlier studies. The ghosts of knowledge do not disappear. They whisper across generations, shaping the sky into a clock that people continue to read. Even myths themselves may carry these ghosts. Flood stories, as we have seen, are nearly universal, but so too are stories of lost golden ages, of times when people knew more than they do now, of teachings handed down from gods or ancestors. In India, the Vedas speak of knowledge preserved through cycles of creation and destruction. In Greece, tales of Prometheus tell of fire given to humans by a figure older than the world of cities. These may be symbolic, but they may also reflect real memories of knowledge carried forward from before the Great Melt. When the seas erased coastlines, people may have preserved fragments in story, fragments that became myth, myth that became sacred text. In this way, knowledge never truly dies. It lingers like a ghost in the cultural imagination. There is something profoundly human in this process. We are not only creatures of survival, but of memory. We keep what we can, even when the form changes. A song remembered imperfectly still carries its melody. A story retold with embellishment still carries its core. A farming technique adapted to new land still carries the old wisdom of the soil. In this sense, every generation is haunted by the ones before it, carrying knowledge whose origins are no longer clear. We know things without knowing how we know them, because they were passed down in ways too subtle to trace. This idea also invites us to see ourselves differently. If ghosts of knowledge surround us, then we are not as separate from the deep past as we imagine. We may be walking with the ideas of people who lived 15 or 20,000 years ago, their thoughts carried invisibly into our own. Every time we plant, measure the stars, or build with stone, we may be repeating gestures far older than history records. Civilization, then, is not a clean break from what came before, but a layering of memories, some clear, some faint, some nearly invisible, but all still present in the fabric of human life. There is also a lesson here about humility. We often imagine that we are the first to understand, the first to invent, the first to create. But knowledge is rarely born from nothing. It is inherited, transformed, reborn. If the Ice Age did hide civilizations, then their ghosts still walk with us, hidden in the practices and stories we call our own. Even if it did not, the ghosts of forgotten peoples, forgotten discoveries, forgotten ways of life remain within us nonetheless. We are never alone in time, we are always accompanied by echoes. And perhaps this is the most haunting thought of all, that the knowledge we carry now will one day be a ghost too. Our technologies, our sciences, our understandings may vanish with us, leaving only fragments for the future to find. But some pieces will survive, perhaps in myth, perhaps in practice, perhaps in ways we cannot yet imagine. We may become the ghosts of knowledge for those who come after, just as those who came before are the ghosts for us. The ghosts of knowledge remind us that the past is never truly gone. It lingers, shaping us in ways we barely notice. Whether the Ice Age civilizations existed or not, the possibility itself is a ghost, haunting our imagination, urging us to wonder. To listen for these ghosts is not to prove or disprove, but to recognize the continuity of human life, the way knowledge flows like a river through time, sometimes clear, sometimes hidden beneath the surface, always moving forward. 17. The silence of evidence. When we search for the past, we often expect it to speak clearly to us. We imagine that ruins will rise from the ground, that artifacts will lie waiting in neat layers of soil, that the earth itself will tell us its story, if only we are patient enough to listen. But the truth is quieter, more difficult. Much of the past is silence gaps where evidence should be but is not, spaces where time has erased all trace. When we wonder about the possibility of an Ice Age civilization, this silence becomes the central challenge. It is not that we lack curiosity, or even that we lack tools. It is that evidence itself can be swallowed so completely by time that it leaves nothing but absence. The Ice Age ended only about 12,000 years ago, which in geological terms is a moment's breath. And yet, in human terms, it is more than enough for entire civilizations to vanish. Wood rots in decades, textiles crumble in centuries, metals corrode in millennia. Only stone endures, and even then, it can be worn smooth, buried, or broken until it no longer reveals its origins. If an Ice Age civilization had built with materials other than stone, the silence we now encounter is exactly what we should expect. It is not surprising. It is inevitable. The ocean adds to this silence. As glaciers melted, seas rose, swallowing coastlines and reshaping continents. Whatever was built there was drowned, buried under layers of sediment, corroded by saltwater, scattered by waves. Underwater archaeology has found fragments, tools, bones, traces of drowned settlements, but only in small pockets. The vast majority remains out of reach, hidden beneath depths that are difficult and costly to explore. What lies beneath the ocean is not absent, but inaccessible, locked away in a silence enforced by water. On land, the silence is just as powerful. Earthquakes shift layers of soil. Volcanoes bury landscapes in ash. Wind and rain grind down surfaces until even great monuments become hills and mounds. In many places, entire histories are still hidden beneath forests, deserts, or farmland. When we look at a meadow or a plain, we see only what is visible. Beneath our feet may lie ruins, but until they are uncovered, they remain part of the silence of evidence. The silence can also be deceptive. Sometimes what we think is absent is simply misinterpreted. A pile of stones may look natural until we notice its deliberate pattern. The carving may seem like erosion until a closer look reveals human intent. But the line between natural and artificial is not always clear, and the further back we look, the harder it becomes to tell. The silence is not only the absence of evidence, but the uncertainty of interpretation. We may be walking past traces every day, dismissing them as nothing because we cannot yet hear their faint voice. This silence is frustrating, but it is also humbling. It reminds us that the past does not belong to us, that time is not obligated to preserve what we hope it will. We approach the past with questions, but the answers are not guaranteed. Instead, we are left with fragments, with whispers, with the faintest hints of lives once lived. The silence fills the spaces between those fragments, forcing us to imagine, to speculate, to wonder. Perhaps this is why the idea of a lost civilization is so powerful. The silence of evidence leaves room for possibility. If we had clear proof of every moment in history, there would be little room for mystery. But because time erases so much, we are left with questions, with the tantalizing sense that there may be more beneath the surface. The silence becomes an invitation to listen more carefully, to look more deeply, to accept that what we know is always incomplete. Even myths may be part of this silence. They speak in symbols, in stories of floods and fires, but they do not tell us in direct detail what happened. They are like faint echoes in a dark cave, distorted by distance and time. They carry memory, but in a way that requires interpretation. They are not absence, but they are not evidence in the traditional sense either. They dwell in the same space as silence, suggesting, hinting, but never speaking plainly. The silence of evidence also extends into the future. One day, our own civilization may fall into it. Our buildings will crumble, our machines will rust, our networks will vanish. Perhaps only fragments of stone will survive, leaving future archaeologists to wonder whether we truly existed at the scale we imagine. To them, we may be nothing but a faint layer of unusual chemicals in the soil, a ghost civilization drowned in silence. In that way, the silence is not only about the Ice Age, it is about all of us. Yet, silence is not emptiness. It is a space where imagination can live, where curiosity can grow. It is a reminder that the world is larger than our knowledge, that time holds more than we can see. The absence of evidence is not proof of absence, it is an open door, a horizon we cannot yet cross. When we sit with the silence, we are sitting with mystery, with possibility, with the endless depth of time. And so, when we ask whether the Ice Age hid a lost civilization, the silence of evidence does not answer us directly. It neither confirms nor denies. It simply waits, as it always has, as it always will, until chance or curiosity uncovers something new. In that waiting, in that quiet, we are reminded that history is not only what we know, but also what we do not know. The silence is part of the story too, a chapter written in absence, a reminder that time speaks softly, and that sometimes the most important thing is not what is said, but what remains unsaid. 18. The pull of myth. Myths are often dismissed as stories, the inventions of ancient peoples to explain what they could not understand. But when we listen carefully, myths do not feel like inventions. They feel like something deeper, like rivers of memory flowing through generations, carrying fragments of truths too large or too distant to be spoken plainly. They are not precise records, but they are not meaningless either. They live in the space between history and imagination, where memory is preserved in symbols, and where truth is carried in story rather than stone. When we wonder about the Ice Age, and whether it hid a lost civilization, it is the pull of myth that draws us closest to that possibility. Consider the flood stories that echo across the world. From Mesopotamia to India, from the Americas to the Pacific Islands, people tell of waters that rose and swallowed lands, of survivors carried away in boats or clinging to mountaintops, of gods or spirits who brought destruction and renewal. These stories are not identical, but they are remarkably similar, as though different cultures were remembering the same kind of event, each in their own language. We know that at the end of the Ice Age, seas did rise, swallowing coasts, flooding valleys, erasing entire landscapes. It is not hard to imagine that the memory of these floods was so profound, so defining that it became myth. But floods are not the only theme. Myths also tell of golden ages, times before the present world, when people lived differently, sometimes more peacefully, sometimes with greater knowledge. They tell of lands that vanished, like Atlantis in Greek tradition or Kumari Kandam in Tamil legend. They tell of gods who walked among humans, teaching them arts and sciences. These may be symbolic, but they may also carry echoes of real changes, real collapses, real memories of ways of life erased by time. The pull of myth is that it always gestures to something larger than itself, something half remembered and half dreamed. There is also the strange persistence of certain symbols. Serpents, for instance, appear in myths across continents, often linked to water, floods, or cycles of destruction and renewal. Stars, too, are central in many traditions, with myths tying human life to celestial movements. Fire, flood, sky, serpent, star. These are recurring motifs, appearing again and again. Did ancient peoples simply converge on the same images? Or are these symbols the vessels of older knowledge, carried forward through countless retellings? The pull of myth suggests that they are more than coincidence. They are the threads of memory woven into story, the way truths survive when all else is lost. What makes myth so powerful is that it does not belong only to the past. We still live with myths today. We tell stories of beginnings, of lost worlds, of possible futures. We imagine cataclysms and rebirths, much as ancient peoples did. Our myths may take the form of science fiction or philosophy rather than sacred texts, but the impulse is the same. We are trying to make sense of change, of fragility, of the knowledge that the world is larger than we can grasp. In this way, myth is not a relic. It is a living force, still shaping how we see the world and ourselves. If we accept this, then the myths of the Ice Age may not be gone. They may still be with us, hidden in the stories we inherit, reshaped over time but still carrying their essence. A story of a world-ending flood may be a memory of rising seas. A story of gods teaching knowledge may be a memory of survivors carrying fragments of older wisdom. A story of a vanished land may be a memory of a coastline swallowed by water. The pull of myth is not toward certainty but toward possibility. It reminds us that memory is not only in artifacts but in imagination. This way of seeing also changes how we think about civilization. If myths preserve truths, then perhaps civilization is not only about building in stone, but about remembering in story. Perhaps the first civilizations were not the ones that built monuments, but the ones that preserved memory, shaping it into myths that could survive across generations. In that sense, the people of the Ice Age were already civilized, even if they left no ruins behind. Their legacy is not only in tools and bones, but in the myths that still move us thousands of years later. There is also a lesson in humility here. We often imagine that we are the first to know, the first to understand, the first to build. But myths whisper otherwise. They tell us that we are part of a much older conversation, one that stretches back beyond history, beyond writing, into the deep time of memory. The pull of myth is the pull of connection to ancestors we cannot name, to experiences we cannot prove but that live in us nonetheless. And perhaps this is why myths matter so deeply when we think about lost civilizations. They are not evidence in the scientific sense, but they are evidence in the human sense. They are the way people carried meaning across time, the way they refused to let their experiences vanish. Myths are the voices of those who lived through floods, fires and endings, speaking to us still. They may be distorted, they may be symbolic, but they are not empty. They are the ghosts of memory, still alive, still pulling us toward the possibility that the world we know is only the surface of something much deeper. To follow the pull of myth is to accept uncertainty, but also to embrace wonder. It is to see the past not as a closed book, but as a living presence, always speaking in whispers. It is to recognize that history is not only what is written, but also what is told, what is remembered, what is dreamed. And it is to feel, in the quiet of story, the presence of all who came before, reminding us that nothing is ever truly lost. It lingers, reshaped, waiting to be heard. 19. Waiting beneath the ice. When we imagine the Ice Age, we often think first of glaciers, great rivers of frozen time stretching across continents. They were not silent decorations upon the earth, but forces of weight and power, carving valleys, grinding mountains, shaping rivers, and sealing away whatever lay beneath them. For tens of thousands of years, these massive sheets of ice moved slowly but relentlessly, covering landscapes that had once been forests, plains, and coasts. Beneath their crushing weight, entire worlds were preserved or erased. And even now, long after the ice has retreated, much still waits beneath, hidden in silence, waiting for discovery. The glaciers of the Ice Age were not static. They advanced and retreated, sometimes over centuries, sometimes over mere decades. As they moved, they buried entire ecosystems, forests, lakes, and rivers, sealing them away in frozen layers. In some places, when the ice finally melted, fragments of those worlds emerged again. Trees that had been frozen whole. Animals like mammoths and woolly rhinos preserved in such detail that their hair and stomach contents were still intact. These glimpses remind us that the ice is both a destroyer and a preserver. It crushes, but it also protects. What lies beneath it may remain untouched for thousands of years, waiting until the world is ready to see it again. If we think of the ice as an archive, then the question arises, what else might it be holding? We know it holds animals, plants, pollen, and even microbes long frozen in time. But might it also hold the traces of human life? Campsites buried under advancing glaciers, tools dropped on frozen ground, even settlements built on lands that were later covered in ice. If civilizations existed during the Ice Age, it is not impossible that some evidence of them is still waiting beneath frozen layers, preserved as carefully as the mammoths we now find thawing in Siberian tundra. This thought is made more compelling by the fact that the ice sheets once covered vast regions where people certainly lived. North America, Northern Europe, and much of Asia were rimmed by glaciers. As people moved through these landscapes, some must have settled near their edges, taking advantage of rivers of meltwater, hunting the herds that roamed nearby. Over time, their traces may have been buried under advancing ice, sealed away in cold silence. When the ice melted, many of those traces would have been erased by floods, but not all. Some may remain, trapped still beneath glaciers in Greenland or Antarctica, places where ice has endured long past the end of the Ice Age. This is where speculation begins to feel like wonder. Antarctica, for instance, has been covered in ice for millions of years, but Greenland only since the most recent Ice Age. Beneath its glaciers may still lie rivers, valleys, and perhaps even evidence of earlier human life, waiting in frozen darkness. Modern technology, with radar and satellites, has begun to map these hidden landscapes, revealing mountain ranges and lake systems no one has seen in tens of thousands of years. What else might be there? What human traces could be waiting to emerge as the ice slowly retreats? The patience of ice is unlike anything we can easily imagine. For us, a century is a long time. For ice, it is a moment. The glaciers have no urgency, no haste. They move with the rhythm of the Earth itself, advancing and retreating in cycles that ignore human timelines. For thousands of years, they have been keeping their secrets, holding them in silence. To think of what waits beneath the ice is to feel the vastness of time pressing against us, reminding us that the world is not made to reveal itself on our schedule. It reveals itself only when it chooses, when the slow melt uncovers what has been hidden. There is also a haunting reflection here. As our own world warms, the ice retreats. We think of this in terms of climate change, in terms of rising seas and shifting weather. But it also means that the secrets of the ice are beginning to emerge. We are already finding mammoths thawing in Siberia, seeds frozen for thousands of years, microbes awakening from dormancy. One day, perhaps, we may also find evidence of human presence long forgotten, revealed not by digging but by melting. The past may come back to us, not through careful excavation, but through the restless movement of the Earth itself. To imagine waiting beneath the ice is also to imagine the resilience of memory. Even when buried, even when crushed, even when sealed away for millennia, something endures. It may be a tool, a bone, a painting on stone hidden deep within a cave. Or it may be something more elusive, a story, carried forward by those who fled as the ice advanced, preserved in myth rather than in artifact. In either case, the ice is not only a physical presence, but a metaphor for time itself, covering, hiding, but never fully erasing. Beneath its silence, the past still waits. And perhaps the deepest lesson is this, that waiting is part of discovery. We cannot force the ice to yield its secrets. We can only watch, listen, and prepare to see what it reveals. The silence beneath the ice is not empty. It is full, holding the weight of countless lives and landscapes. To wonder about it is to acknowledge that history is larger than us, that time stretches beyond our reach, and that patience is the only way to meet it. So when we imagine what may be waiting beneath the ice, we are imagining more than frozen bones or buried tools. We are imagining the possibility that our story is older, richer, and more layered than we know. We are imagining that even in silence, memory endures. And we are imagining that one day, as the glaciers continue their slow retreat, the past may rise again, stepping out of the ice into the light to remind us that nothing is ever truly lost, only waiting to be found. 20. The edge of knowing. There is a place in every story where certainty fades and wonder begins, a boundary where knowledge gives way to imagination. That is where we now find ourselves, standing at the edge of knowing. We have walked through the Ice Age together, through its glaciers and its coastlines, its floods and its myths, its silences and its traces. We have asked whether a civilization might have flourished there, only to be erased by time and tide. And yet, for all the questions we have raised, the answers remain elusive. What we know is small. What we do not know is vast. The edge of knowing is not a wall but a horizon. History, as we tell it, is a fragile thing. It depends on what survives stones in the ground, bones in caves, shards of pottery buried in soil. These fragments give us glimpses, but they do not give us the whole. The further back we look, the fewer fragments remain, until at last we are left with silence. And in that silence, imagination stirs. Perhaps there were civilizations along the Ice Age shores, now drowned beneath the sea. Perhaps their knowledge lived on in myths, in sudden leaps of human progress, in the fragments we cannot explain. Perhaps what we call the beginning of civilization was only a beginning again. The edge of knowing does not deny these possibilities, it invites them. But the edge of knowing also asks for humility. We are not the masters of time nor the keepers of all memory. We are travellers, walking through landscapes shaped long before us, carrying the fragments we have found and wondering at the ones we have lost. The Ice Age reminds us that the Earth itself is not fixed, that seas rise and lands vanish, that what seems eternal can disappear in a single lifetime. Civilizations are not immune to this. They too are fragile, built on shifting ground. To recognize this is to step gently, to see ourselves not as permanent rulers, but as fleeting participants in a much larger story. At the edge of knowing, we must also reflect on what it means to remember. We often think of memory as belonging only to humans, but the Earth remembers too. It remembers in stone, in ice, in the quiet layers of the ocean floor. It remembers in myths carried across generations, in DNA passed from parent to child, in the stars still mapped by ancient hands. The Ice Age may be distant, but its memory is still with us in the floods recorded in story, in the tools preserved in caves, in the landscapes shaped by glaciers long gone. To stand at the edge of knowing is to realize that memory is everywhere, waiting to be recognized. There is beauty in the uncertainty. If we knew everything, there would be no wonder. If history were complete, there would be no room for imagination. It is precisely because so much is lost that we are drawn to seek, to dream, to ask questions that may never be answered. Did a civilization rise during the Ice Age only to vanish? Did its survivors carry fragments of knowledge forward, shaping the world we now know? We cannot say for certain, but the possibility is enough to change how we see the past. It reminds us that history is not fixed, but open, alive, filled with mysteries that keep us curious. The edge of knowing is also where past and future meet. As we look back to the Ice Age, we also glimpse forward to our own time. We see how rising seas drowned worlds, and we wonder how our own coastal cities might one day be remembered or forgotten. We see how civilizations may vanish, leaving only fragments, and we wonder what fragments of ours will endure. We see how myths preserved memory when all else was lost, and we wonder what stories of our time will be carried into the future. The Ice Age is not only behind us. It is a mirror, showing us what can be lost, what can survive, and what it means to live in a world that is always changing. Perhaps this is the greatest gift of standing at the edge of knowing. It teaches us to be at peace with not knowing. It invites us to linger in mystery, to accept that silence is part of the story, to listen not only for answers but for echoes. It asks us to hold questions gently, as one might hold a seashell that still carries the sound of the ocean. The Ice Age may or may not have hidden a lost civilization. We may never know for certain. But in wondering, we honor the memory of those who lived through it, those whose lives were shaped by cold and flood, those whose traces are faint but enduring. And so, as we close this journey, we stand once more on the shore of time, looking out across the waves of memory. The sea is vast, the past is deep, and we are only beginning to understand. The Ice Age whispers to us still, in stone, in story, in silence. What if it did hide a civilization? What if fragments of it remain in us, in our myths, in the knowledge we carry without knowing its origin? At the edge of knowing, we do not need certainty. We need only the willingness to wonder, to imagine, to listen. For in the end, history is not only about answers, it is about the questions we dare to ask, the mysteries we dare to hold, the silences we dare to honor. At the edge of knowing, the past and the future touch, and we are reminded that we too are part of this great flow of time, fragile, temporary, but enduring in memory, just as those before us endure in myth. The Ice Age is gone, but its mysteries remain, waiting like stars just beyond the horizon. And as long as we wonder, as long as we listen, as long as we dream, we will always stand at the edge of knowing.